In this episode, I want to do a fun little exercise in refactoring a long method, make it more concise. So what I have here is a cart model, and a cart has many line items, and each line item belongs to a product. So it's a fairly standard e-commerce style shopping cart system. Now what I have here is a shipping price method, and to calculate the shipping price, I first need to figure out the total weight of the cart, and that's what this is doing. Grabs the total weight, it loops through all the line items, and if that line item isn't for download, it adds its weight of the product to our local variable there. And then once we have the total weight, we can determine the cost of the price of the shipping. Before I move into refactoring this, I'm going to start up our test suite using autotest. And it's very important before refactoring to make sure that the method you're refactoring is well covered, and that way you don't accidentally change the behavior and break something through your refactoring. Okay, so how do we refactor a method and make it shorter and more concise? Well, the first thing to do is look for local variables, because local variables usually assign that you're calculating something, and usually you can move that calculation into a method on its own. So let's make a method, and I'm just going to give it the same name, and usually that's what you can do. And then I'm just going to return our local variable. So we still have our local variable here, but at least it's in its own method now. And that works as well. Okay, so we have our local variable here in its own method. How do we remove this local variable entirely and just calculate the total weight of the line items directly? Well, in this situation, it's really helpful to get a good understanding of all the different methods that Rails and Ruby gives us on enumerable and array and so on, because they're really helpful in doing refactorings like this. So it happens that there's a method called sum that Rails gives us that we can call on an array, and this will just, if we pass a block to this, for each item, for whatever we return in that block, it'll all be added together, and that value will be returned. Now there's a little gotcha here, and that is if we call sum directly on line items, because it's an active record association, it will try to perform the sum directly in the database, and we don't want that. So I'm going to just get around that by converting it to an array first. Okay, so let's see if that works as well. And actually it doesn't. We get an error here. It says nil can't be coerced into float, and that's basically saying that this is returning nil sometimes as block when line item is not for download. So let's make it return 0 when it's for download. Otherwise, return the product weight. That way, it knows how to sum all the weight up, and it'll work. Okay, notice that we're calling line item. We're calling a couple methods on line item directly in this little block here. And usually if you're calling a couple methods on an object, usually you can move that into the object itself. So we'll make a new method here. Let's call it weight. And make a new method called weight in here. Basically just perform the same calculations on here. And since we're inside of our line item model, we don't need to reference those methods through line item anymore. Let's make sure this works. Looks like it does. There we go. Okay. So this weight is now such a simple if condition. We can also make this more concise by doing this other syntax for if conditions, just like this. Now some prefer this approach, some don't, but I kind of like it for simple if conditions like we're doing here. And we can also make this more concise using symbol to proc, because we're just calling a single method on an object we're passing to a block. And I show this more in episode 6. So that will make that more concise, and let's see if this is still working. And it is. Alright. So far things are shaping up pretty well. It's a lot more concise. Now, if you notice something, it's not quite as efficient as it was before, because we're calling total weight 3 times here, and each time it has to loop through the line items and calculate the total weight. Now if this is a problem, we can get around this by storing it, caching it into a local or an instance variable. Let me call it total weight. Using this or equal symbol here, that will actually just it'll just perform the calculation the very first time the method is called, and after that it will return the value inside of the instance variable. And I show you this more in episode 1. Okay, so that way it'll only be calculated one time when this method's called. And last but not least, it would be nice to refactor this shipping price method because it has a lot of if-else conditions. It's kind of ugly. And notice that we're referencing numbers several times here, 3, 5, 8, 10, 12, and so on. Well, if you're ever doing this, there's a good chance this doesn't belong inside of Ruby code at all, actually. Because this kind of thing we might want to change later on, and we don't want to have to dive into the code in order to change the price of our shipping. So this, I think, should be moved into a database table. So what I would do is create a new model called shipping prices, and it can have store the max weight, whatever this value is, and the price for that weight. And that way we can just do a find on that model and determine the total price for the total weight for the cart through that. Now I don't have time to get into that in this episode, but that's just a little refactoring I would do to improve this code right in there. But the other code for determining the weight is all nice and concise now, and I'm pretty happy with it. Now, of course, your mileage may vary, and you may not actually want to refactor into this extreme approach. It's just kind of a personal preference on what style of programming you prefer, if you like these one-liner methods, which I kind of do. So that's it for this episode. See you next week. This episode is sponsored by Peepcode. Please visit peepcode.com and check out their latest screencasts on Ruby on Rails.